Welcome, listeners. This is Sebastian Nothwell here today with Sarah Wallace,
Hello.
and we will be talking about the Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress. Now, Sarah, the question on the tip of everyone's tongue at this very moment: what is the Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress?
It is the fifth book in my series, Meddle and Mend, which is a series set in an alternate Regency period with magic and a queer normative society. And it tells the story of Jerry Hartford, who is the sister of the main character in Letters to Half Moon Street, Gavin Hartford. So we're finally getting her story.
So how does it feel to finally reach this point in the series? Because I get the impression people have been waiting for Jerry's story specifically for a while. She did seem like kind of a standout character in Letters to Half Moon Street.
It feels good. It's been a long time coming. I wrote Letters to Half Moon Street about 4 years ago, and I finished the first draft of this book 2 years ago. So it took a while to get to Jerry's book, and it was one of the hardest books to write in the series. So I am excited to finally share it with people.
How does this book differ from others in the series?
Well, first, it's the first book in the series with multiple points of view, unless you count the multiple letters from different points of view in Letters to Half Moon Street. But this is the first one with a third person limited point of view with multiple points of view. And there are 4 points of view characters in the book. So it differs in that way. And it's also by far the longest book in the series. Basically, it's twice as long as Letters to Half Moon Street.
I mean, you did double the number of protagonists, so that seems
I
fitting.
did. I did. It's also the first male-female romance in the series.
And yet, still queer.
And yet, still queer. Both the main characters are queer.
Just a fun reminder for everyone out there.
Male-female relationships can and often are queer.
Fun fact, you don't stop being queer when you settle down.
Really don't. And, I mean, since we're on the soapbox already, we can continue on it. I like to think our listeners already know this, but sometimes queerness is not dependent on who you're attracted to, but whether or not you are attracted to people at all and how you identify in terms of your gender. So queerness can be multifaceted. So in this case, we have one main character who's attracted to multiple people and another main character who is only romantically attracted to people after getting to know them really well. In other words, demi-romantic. So that is how the queerness presents itself in this book for the two main characters.
What were you most excited to write about in this book?
Well, I wrote this book very much out of order. Because I just skipped ahead to the scenes I was most excited to write. So the library scene and the scene in the rain are two scenes that I wrote well ahead of where they are in the book. And when I finally got to Modesty Monroe's character, her scenes are some of the most fun to write in the whole book. They were a blast. She's a very fun character to write.
I mean, Modesty Monroe is already a name that I feel like tells you, at the very least, it intrigues you if it doesn't tell you everything.
Yes. A reader one time described her as what Charles is to the Hartford family, Modesty is to Basil, who's the male main character in this romance. So she is Basil's found family, and she's the one who kind of pushes him along when he needs the nudge. So she was very fun.
Now, you mentioned writing out of order. Is that a new process for you? Do you typically write sequentially or as the spirit moves you?
Emphasis moves me. So with co-authoring, I've been writing in order because each scene kind of relies on the previous scene. Since with co-authoring, you don't always know what your partner's going to write, so you kind of have to wait. But when writing alone, I do often write out of order a lot because if there's a scene that I'm particularly excited to write or that feels like kind of imperative to the plot, I'll sometimes write that first and then build up to it. So I feel like when I'm writing solo, I tend to write in the way that if you know anything about how animation works, typically you have your lead animators who draw the primary moments for the characters or the scene, and then you have other animators who will basically bridge the gap between those expressions. And so I tend to write the big scenes that I know I want to write, and then I'll go in afterwards and bridge those scenes together so that they make sense. So that's kind of how I typically write when I'm writing solo books.
I've heard that process called quilting.
Oh, I've never heard that. That makes sense, though. To put the pieces together, to design the layout and then stitch them together.
Yeah.
That's cool. I like that. It's nice because you get to like the quote unquote fun stuff first, and then you kind of know what you're building up to. So like there are scenes in the Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress that, like I said, I had written in advance, or like I knew I was going to write, and so it was kind of fun building up to, like, there's a scene with Basil and one of his younger siblings where he like comforts one of his younger siblings. And I had written that very early on in the process. It was part of one of the earlier drafts of the book. Like I said, it's the hardest to write because I wrote it multiple times. So I've rewritten this book probably most out of every book in the series. Like Modesty's character in particular changed a lot. She was originally going to be Basil's fiance.
Oh, there's a complication.
Yeah, and she was originally going to be like Veronica, which is the Hartford's sister-in-law, like her one of her good friends from school. So she was like absolutely horrible. So it was going to be this sort of weird love triangle where Basil's trying to choose between the woman he's engaged to and the woman he's falling in love with, and the woman he's engaged to is terrible, and all this stuff. And then I was like partway through writing that version, and I was like, I actually hate this. So I scrapped a lot of it.
As a wise man once said, actually, fuck this.
Actually, fuck this. This is terrible. And I started over basically and wrote it still with Modesty being the fiance, but she was nice. And then that was even more difficult, honestly, because it was like, what? But I really hate love triangles. Why am I writing a love triangle? And I was trying to figure out how to get Modesty into a different relationship so that she could be happy and then Basil could be free to marry Jerry. And I was like, this is very complicated. So then I finally scrapped the whole love triangle thing and started with just Modesty being his friend. And that opened up the book significantly, and it became a lot easier to write after that. But that's one of the reasons this book took like 2 years to write, because I kept trying different strategies and I kept getting stalled because I couldn't figure out how to make it work. But like the scene with Basil and his little brother was in there from, I think, version 1 of the book. I had known I wanted this scene. And so that really like gave me a lot of insight into who I wanted Basil to be. So that was helpful. And there were scenes that I had written in the first draft that I was very proud of. Specifically, the story sort of started off as a Sense and Sensibility inspired book with the notion of what if John Dashwood was not the worst? And what if the older half brother who inherits the family property is actually a decent human being and takes care of his family? So that was the main premise of this book, because I was trying to think of why on earth so many single people keep showing up and Tutting-on-Cress. So supposedly a small town. So I was like, well, John Dashwood would have been kind of new to the neighborhood because he hasn't been there in like 20 years or something. So I went with that. But I decided to do like a kind of a typical historical romance thing where I gave him a whole bunch of siblings. I had written a bunch of scenes with the siblings talking to each other, and they were such fun scenes to write that I really wanted to keep them in because I felt like I really was able to capture each of the different children's personalities in those scenes. And so I really wanted to keep them intact. But a lot of the early scenes with these kids hinged on them thinking that Basil was engaged when I had scrapped that plot. So I wound up having to do some mental gymnastics to make them think that he's engaged when he's really not, to add like a little flavor of complexity to the plot, that the kids all think that he's engaged. So they're trying to connive a way to get him not engaged so he can marry Jerry, and he's actually completely unaware of the fact they think this. But yeah, so those scenes were very fun to write, and they were so important that I had to keep them in. So I had to write the plot around these scenes to make them work.
It is fun to have not just the fake engagement trope, but the fake engagement where one of the parties doesn't even know they're involved.
Yes. 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 One of the conversations where one of the siblings is like kind of a bloodthirsty little character, and they're like, what are we gonna do about this fiance? And she's like, I have ideas. And like, no, nothing too violent though. Like, what if she's terrible? And the sister's like, we'll dispose of her then. And they're like, okay, well. And so it was too funny to have this little like 10-year-old girl who's like, I know what we can do. We'll just kill her.
I've got it. Don't worry, guys. I'm on the case. So, Basil is an entirely new character to the series.
Yes, he is brand new. He and his whole family are actually brand new. It's hinted that they've been in Tutting-on-Cress all along. It's just that none of the Hartfords have really interacted with them to the point where they talk about them at home. But yes, so there are a lot of new characters in this one. So we've got Basil Thorne and his whole family are all new characters. Modesty Monroe is a brand new character. Jerry has a bunch of friends who you mostly meet in The Glamorous Belle of Rose Talbot. So if you've read that book or that novelette, you'll have a better idea of some of the women in that book. And we meet a lot of characters that we've already met before. So we get to see Lawrence Ailes and his family. We see all of the Hartford siblings. BC Birdie and the Jukix of Mulberry. So we get a lot of recurring characters from previous books. And we meet Veronica, I would say finally, although I don't think anyone's like, yay! We get to meet we meet Veronica Hartford, who's the dreaded sister-in-law that everyone hates. We get to meet her too.
What challenges were presented by crafting a new suitable partner for a character that readers are already invested in? Because, like, Jerry's been a favorite, and she's been there from book one, Letters to Half Moon Street, kind of working behind the scenes to better the lives of her siblings. So, what were the challenges in making, like, not an established character, but a whole new person?
Yeah, that's a good question. He was kind of at first tricky to write because there was a lot of pressure to make sure he deserved her. Because when it comes to beloved characters, and especially like female characters who are kind of smart and spunky and kind hearted and bold, it's kind of hard to find someone to match that energy where you don't feel like she's settling for somebody. So, when I write books, especially romances, I tend to write from the perspective of what does my main character need? That's usually how I craft my love interests for my main characters. And it's not necessarily what will be like the foil for them, but like what does that character specifically need in a relationship? And then I build the character around that. So with Jerry, I wanted somebody who appreciated her and who would be incredibly supportive and didn't need to be somebody who understood magic because she kind of already has that in her life, where she has friends who are academically interested in magic and sort of invested in talking to her about magic. So she really just needed somebody who would support her and who would encourage her and who would think that she was the most brilliant and fascinating person they'd ever met. Was kind of my approach to Basil. And I wanted them to be kind because Jerry's nice and she's demi-romantic, but she's also, I think, one thing that's kind of interesting about being demi-romantic and on the aromantic spectrum at all, really, is that you can be like a romantic at heart, but still be on the aromantic spectrum. And that's one of the reasons that I took a long time discovering that I was on the aromantic spectrum, because I considered myself a romantic at heart. And Jerry is similar, where she wants romance very much. And she is a big believer in romance, and she wants to be swept off her feet, but she doesn't actually feel romantic attraction to people easily. So I needed somebody who would kind of fit her ideal of romance. And so someone who would be not necessarily dashing, but someone who could effectively make her feel seen and valued. And when I chose the plot point of Basil inherits the family property and then allows his family to stay, it pretty quickly fell into place that he's a very generous person. Because in the Regency period, you inherit your fortune, you kind of have the right to do whatever you want with it. So you can kick your whole family out, and no law is going to say that's bad. Like, people might look askance at you, but technically even society isn't really going to be like, wow, that was harsh. They're like, well, it's his right to do that. So he's using his inheritance to pay for his family and to support his family, which was not technically required of him at the time. And so that says a lot about his personality already, that he is generous and kind. So that thankfully kind of already lent itself to Jerry's getting a really nice guy, which is important. And he's just incredibly supportive from like the minute he meets her, and just thinks she's the coolest person he's ever met, basically. Which I feel like is what Jerry needs. Is he needs someone who is unquestioningly supportive of her and encourages her and is happy to hear her talk about magic all day. And they're not going to be like, wow, could you please stop talking about this? I'm bored. He will listen to her talk about whatever she wants to talk about, and he will be like, wow, you're so smart. This is amazing. I feel like that's what Jerry needed.
It's what she deserves, frankly.
It is, exactly. Yeah. And that was, I think, the biggest thing, was making sure that readers would walk away feeling like she got the kind of guy that they wanted her to get, or the guy she deserves, somebody who will fully appreciate her. Because it's the worst when you've been following a series and you really are hoping for a character to get a really great love interest, and then they don't. It's very disappointing. And so I wanted to make sure he was great. So far, people really like him, which is nice. So
Excellent. So, what surprised you while you were writing this book?
the theme of grief was an unexpected one. I hadn't really planned on Basil's grief and his whole family's grief as they processed the death of their father to be as big a part in the book as it turned out to be. I'm glad it did, because I think I was able to kind of talk about how grief affects everyone a little bit differently. Jerry's demi-romantic identity was not something I necessarily planned on. It just kind of happened. And sort of similar to Gavin being demisexual, I sort of accidentally wrote Jerry as demi-romantic, and then someone commented on it, and so then I went and did it on purpose. And so I wrote her as a demi-romantic character and like revised the story to make sure that it fit. It's one of the things that made it fall into place, that she's been dreaming of this idea of what it will be like to fall in love, and then it's not what she'd imagined. Because I feel like that's probably the case for a lot of demi-romantic people who are expecting romance to be a certain way, and probably aromantic people in general. That they expect romance to be a certain way, and then it doesn't feel that way when they get there. And so I think that that aspect of the book surprised me. I didn't necessarily plan on that being the challenge. Sort of one of the things about what was hard to write about with this book was the conflict was kind of hard to determine, because especially when I took out the love triangle, there wasn't any good reason for why they don't just fall in love and get married. And so having Jerry kind of grappling with her feelings allowed me to have a bit of conflict there. And then Basil is sort of grappling with his grief and his feelings of responsibility, which gave his conflict. And so it wound up working out really nicely, but like I think the things that surprised me most were what wound up being the central conflict of the story, because it was hard to identify that from when I started version 3 of the book.
That is one of the joys of doing multiple drafts, is being able to go through and find all the themes that have kind of emerged on their own and being able to amplify them and give them more of a more prominent place in the narrative where they can really like shine.
Yeah, agreed. And like the benefit too with writing multiple versions is that you figure out what you don't want. Pretty decisively, you figure out what you don't want in the book, which is also helpful because it helps you to sort of go down the right path when you're writing it, because then you feel a little bit more confident with where you're going because you already know what it's not.
Yeah, it's always a joy learning that you don't have to write things you don't like.
Yes, really is. And this can serve as a reminder for any writers out there who are listening that if you're writing a book and it's not going the way you want it to, or you're not happy with it, you can accept this as permission to change your mind and step back and, you know, not just like start over, but figure out what parts of the book you do like and what isn't working and what you're not liking about the book, so you can sort of reevaluate where you want the book to go. Because this book definitely was one of those for me where I had to take a big step back and figure out what wasn't working, why I wasn't liking the book the way it was going. And it was difficult starting over for the second time. Third version was challenging because it was like I had written like half the book, and since I write out of order, I had written multiple. For the first version, I had written like a whole fight scene with, not fight, but like an argument scene between Basil and Modesty where they were going to finally break up, and like I had a whole plot point with one of Basil's siblings where she was going to find a spell that Jerry wrote and was going to do it, and it was going to go poorly, and then Jerry had to save her. It was this whole convoluted story that I had mapped out and written part of it. It was really hard to scrap all of that and start fresh and just figure out what from the book I wanted to salvage, what was worth keeping. And so I rewrote it with a nicer version of Modesty, and then that also didn't work, so I had to scrap it all over again and start over with Modesty as a very different character. And like it worked much better that way, obviously, but like it is hard. And like I said, it took me 2 years to write this book because there was a lot of rewriting and reevaluating and deleting everything I'd written and starting over kind of thing. But this is the longest book, so clearly that did not keep me from writing the story I wanted to write in the end. So
It's about the journey.
it's about the journey.
Speaking of which, where will the Meddle and Mend series go from here?
So I've got 8 books planned. I'm going to do a pause after book 6 comes out. Book 6 is a sort of epilogue. Going to come out in February, and I think it will serve as a good temporary finale to the series until I feel a little less burnt out and can write the rest of the series. But the 6th book is going to tie up a loose end for one of the characters who has like a happily for now. Going to give them a happily ever after. And then anybody who reads book 5, Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress, will probably recognize that I've started a character redemption arc. That redemption arc is going to be fully realized by the end of the series. And then I've also got a side character who, when Letters to Half Moon Street was released, there were not a lot. It doesn't take much. It doesn't take much encouragement to be like, oh, that's a great idea. I'll write a whole book about this. But I have a side character I've had people say they want a book about this character. So I've got an idea for this book, but every time I sit down to try to write it, I'm feeling kind of stuck. So book 7 is going to be another epistolary novel because I love them. But now that I know how hard epistolary novels are to write, I'm having a much harder time getting into this because I'm like, oh no, It was really hard. Uh,
Oh, now you know what you're getting into.
Yeah, I'm not as naive as I was in 2020, where I was like, I know, I will write. And I'm also suffering from that issue of comparing my rough draft to my final polished, published version of the other book. So I'm writing this rough draft of book 7 and struggling because I'm like, this isn't as good as book 1. Of course it isn't, as the rough draft. It's not supposed to be as good as book 1. So I need to kind of shut out that expectation and just write the book and be okay with it being sloppy and then go through and clean it up. But I haven't gotten past that first hurdle, so I keep stalling because I want to hammer out this perfect, beautiful, publication ready first draft, which is not actually going to happen. It's okay, but I need to let go of the expectations so I can work on book 7. But it's going to continue as it began, where it's going to focus on a different main character each time, but each book is going to sort of layer the series more and more. So we're going to continue seeing favorite characters. All of the characters you know and love should still be in the series. I say should as in I don't know who all your favorite characters are, so I don't know if there's a character that hasn't been seen in a while. But yeah. And I've got a sequel series planned and partially started, but writing 8 books is a rough thing to start off with, and I got burned out about halfway through the series. So I've been pausing on writing anything new with it until I basically don't feel like it's a chore and I'm excited to write it again. Because the book will only be good if I'm excited to write it. So, but I do have 7 other books planned as a sequel series to this one, because Basil has 7 siblings, and so I want to have a spin-off series with Basil and Jerry's book. The Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress is going to be book 1 in the sequel series, and then we'll have a book chronicling the story of each of the 7 siblings. And I've got 2 of them partially written, because I follow plot bunnies quite a lot. But they're only partially written, and I need to actually write them. And I need to write books 7 and 8 of Meddle and Mend before I finish anything from the Thorn series. So yeah, so that's what you can expect. More meddling, more mending, more of the characters you know and hopefully love. Book 6 will be coming out in February of next year. Books 7 and 8, hopefully sooner rather than later, but they're not written yet, so I don't know yet when they will be released. But hopefully sooner rather than later.
In that case, when does the Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress come out, and where can people pre-order it?
It is coming out June 28th, and you can pre-order it on paperback and ebook wherever you buy your books. Actually, I think you can pre-order on audiobook too now. So you can pre-order it paperback, ebook, and audiobook on all of the platforms. I am working on getting a hardcover, large print, and dyslexia font print for the Spellmaster of Tutting-on-Cress, but it might be a few months before I have those ready to go, because it takes a while to get those set up. But paperback, ebook, and audiobook are available for pre-order now. And if you pre-order the book for the 28th, quite frankly, if you order it before the end of June, and you fill out the form at my link in bio on Instagram, you can get a free art print as well. Or if you order the book directly from my website, you can get a free art print. So
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the pod again, Sarah, and excited to join you for another roundtable soon.
thank you so much. This was so fun.